In 1823, the quiet town of Mill Creek, Pennsylvania, became home to the Hollinger family, recent arrivals from Maryland who opened the region's first funeral and embalming service. At a time when rural burials often occurred at home, the Hollingers' offer of professional Christian preparation of the dead drew immediate clientele. But by the winter of 1825, townspeople began vanishing, mostly traveling salesmen and widows without kin. The family claimed these victims had succumbed to illness on the road and offered to handle their burials at no charge. Decades later, during a renovation of the old Hollinger property, workers unearthed over 30 skeletons, stacked behind false walls of the embalming cellar, each missing valuables and teeth. A ledger recovered on site, attributed to Matthias Hollinger Sester, recorded payments from the deceased written in the patriarch's own hand. Local authorities sealed the findings, citing the family's prominent church ties. The coroner's report mysteriously disappeared from the Lancaster County archives in 1892, replaced by a single note reading, "Records removed for preservation." Today, the site lies beneath a modern residential block. Locals still refer to the area as Hollow Yard, claiming that late at night, you can still smell the sweet, acrid scent of embalming fluid rising from the ground. In a basement where the stone walls sweat and the oil lamps make their own smoke, a clerk prays open a wooden crate stenciled Coroner, Mael Kirik. Inside, the folders have curled like autumn leaves. On one slim file, where a report should be, the only text is a 3-word note in pale blue pencil, precise and final, "Records removed for preservation." He turns the page. There is nothing behind it. Now wind back to December 1825. Mill Creek, a quiet town pinned between woods and water. Nights so black you could hear snow falling before you saw it. A new shingle hangs on a clapboard house, Hollinger & Son, Christian preparation of the dead. The lettering is clean, the edges plain smooth, the door newly painted. Behind it, a cellar door braced with a fresh beam. On the main hall table a lead, capped inkwell, a ledger with oxblood ink, and a neat line written in the patriarch's hand. By the grace of God, we ease the passage. The Hollingers had arrived 2 years earlier from Maryland. Matthias Hollinger Sr., a stoic man with hands like mallets. His wife, a quiet presence rumored to sing hymns while she scrubbed. 2 sons of working age, a daughter who wore black even in summer. They brought a trade unusual for rural Pennsylvania in 1823, embalming and formal Christian preparation. In a place where most people laid their dead out on kitchen tables and called on a neighbor with a plane to build a coffin, the Hollingers offered something polished, professional, and, according to their handbills, pious. Cleanliness, dignity, and scripture, the flyer read. No family turned away. The elders nodded. The town, hushed by winter loss and cholera's occasional shadow, was ready to be reassured. But reassurance can be a mask. By late 1825, Mill Creek began to thin, not in broad daylight, but in the margins. Traveling salesmen who traded buttons and pins at farmhouse doors failed to return to their boarding houses. A young widow with no close kin, last seen buying flour, simply did not come home. A tinsmith who mended kettles up and down the turnpike left his trunk at the livery and did not collect it. Each time, the Hollingers appeared first with news. He took ill by the bridge. She succumbed to a fever that took her quick. Each time, Matthias offered, at no charge, to handle the body in a respectable Christian manner and arranged burial with a speed that felt, to some, like a kindness. A minister's daybook, found much later in a box of church tracts, contains a line that reads like a cold breath. Hollinger family performed a service this day for a stranger, no known relations. A quiet proceeding, teeth in poor condition. Below it, in a different ink, no fee taken. And then, decades later, the ground gave an answer the town had failed to ask of itself. During a renovation on the old Hollinger property, by then a warehouse with a sagging porch, workers pried away a false wall in the cellar and stepped into a charnel mathematics. Bones stacked in neat occluded rows, skulls winked smooth by time, each missing molars and incisors, each owner stripped of whatever they carried to mark them as someone. Over 30 skeletons, not laid in any churchyard, hidden. There was a ledger in that cellar too, brittle at the edges and reeking faintly of something sweet and acrid. Embalming tinctures, or a ghost of them leaching into the page. The hand is the same poised script from 1823. The entries are obscene in their serenity. From the estate of the deceased, $2, coins retrieved, payment in watch, no name on movement, a small gold cross, no inscription, and again, this phrase, remittance recorded from the deceased, as if death could write a check. Local authorities moved quickly, and then not at all. The sheriff, who sat in the Hollingers' pew every Sunday, sealed the cellar and posted a notice that the site was under official investigation. The coroner came, took notes, took samples, and prepared a report that, if it ever existed at all, is now a ghost, a docket number, a signature in a log, and then that blue pencil epitaph in 1892, records removed for preservation. So what do we know? We know the Hollingers opened their doors in 1823 and called their work holy. We know that, in 1825, Mill Creek began to suffer strange absences among the unattached and the unmissed. We know that a ledger, attributed to Matthias Sayre, records, payments, nobody could make, and that a wall hid bones no family mourned in public. We know authorities sealed more than a cellar, and that the county's record of why was quietly erased. What we do not know is this: who laid those people behind that wall, and why? Were the Hollingers devout undertakers swallowed by rumor? Or were they something else? A family who stood at the gate of the last passage and decided who could pass, and who would be stacked away where only a renovation would find them. The records call it preservation. The ground calls it proof. But why did this happen? And why was it erased from history? Before we continue, if this story intrigues you, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. And tell us what city or state you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of history enthusiasts. Backstory: Mill Creek in 1823 was a place of hard lines and small margins. The turnpike brought peddlers with packs strapped to their backs and news folded into their hats. Farmsteads dotted the hills, a tavern squatted by the bridge, a meeting house gathered souls on Sundays, and stitched marriages and funerals together into a fabric people called community. Death was a domestic affair. When someone died, neighbors washed and dressed the body. A cabinet maker provided a plain pine coffin for a few dollars. Burial followed on a rise behind the meeting house or in a family plot tucked among corn rows. Embalming, the practice of chemically preserving bodies, was more rumor than routine. Europeans had their pharaohs and their surgeons. Rural Pennsylvania had winter and swift burials. But the Second Great Awakening was kindling across the countryside. And with it came a taste for moral polish, for the idea that even the dead should be arranged with a dignity that looked like good manners under God. Into that appetite stepped the Hollingers. They moved north from Maryland in the spring of 1823. In a letter preserved by a distant relative, its paper thin as onion skin, Matthias refers to seeking a place where our trade will be a blessing. He knew carpentry. He knew scripture well enough to quote it by number. And he had, perhaps from a Baltimore surgical man, a recipe written in brown ink for a preserving liquid spirits of wine, camphor, essence of wintergreen, a pinch of arsenic powder. It smelled clean, almost sweet. It made the work seem like care. The Hollingers set their home halfway between tavern and meeting house, where they could see grief coming in either direction. Their handbill, one of which survives in a church scrapbook, pressed between funeral sermons like a leaf, promised Christian preparation of the dead, modest ornamentation, and prayers said at cost. They offered to keep the unclaimed until arrangements could be made. In a community where no one wanted to imagine dying far from kin, that last promise was honeyed. On Sunday mornings, the family occupied a prominent pew. Matthias read aloud when the pastor's voice went hoarse. The older son joined the choir. The younger hauled water. The daughter, name withheld in most recollections, as if even memory wanted to protect her, embroidered, "Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord," in white silk on black cloth, and tacked it above the washstand, where bodies were laid and cooled, a respectable surface, polished to a shine. Underneath, The weakness of the time travel without identification, records kept in Bibles more than in courthouses, a prejudice that counted some lives dear and others inconvenient, and a science not yet certain of itself, stumbling at the line where life becomes whatever comes next. The first missing man left a trunk at the tavern, and a promise to return for it after he called on the farmsteads west of the creek. He was a tin peddler, known by his whistle and the clatter of his wares, a harmless chatterer whose stories were as thin as his cups. 2 days later, he hadn't come back. The tavern keeper shrugged. Men take sick on the road. The Hollingers came in the next morning with grave faces. He fell by the bridge, Matthias said. Fever took him. We brought him to our cellar for Christian tending. There was no family address in his pack. The tavern keeper, relieved to be spared the bother, nodded. The funeral was held, if you could call it that, on a weekday afternoon, under a light snowfall, with 2 men from the meeting house and Matthias reading a psalm. Within a month, it happened again. A widow, call her RM, as town notes do, half in pity, half in propriety, did not answer when her neighbor knocked. The neighbor found a note at the door. Gone to the Hollingers, feeling poorly. By supper, the news had spread she had passed quietly. The Hollingers again. No charge. The coffin lid was already pegged down by the time the neighbor arrived, breathless, with a ribbon she'd meant to tie at RM's wrist. If you look at what records remain from that winter, they form a pattern like footprints half obliterated by wind. An elder writes, many sicknesses this season. A page in the meeting house minutes lists burials that have no kin attending. A blacksmith jots in his account book, made 6 handles. Matthias paid in coin, benediction said. A young itinerant preacher notes in his journal, called to pray over a stranger at Hollingers. Odor of wintergreen. When the thaw came, the creek ran high, and so did talk. A peddler's trunk went to auction. Inside, a bundle of letters addressed to him from a mother in Delaware County. No one could say why the Hollingers hadn't found them. We searched his pockets, Matthias replied, and found nothing. The letters, sold in a lot with the trunk, were burned by the buyer. Better not to invite the dead to linger. By summer, the ledger in the Hollinger cellar, later recovered, its spine warm and metallic with the smell of time, records the names of the season's work. Stranger, no relations, laid out, prayer said, woman widow, cause of fever, and under a column no honest book should have, remittance. In the late 1820s, dentists in Philadelphia paid good money for human teeth. Waterloo teeth. They called them when they came from battlefields, but any sound enamel would do. Dentures set with real human teeth were a middle-class luxury. The dead, in this calculus, became a resource. Decades later, when a mason's hammer knocked through the false wall in the old Hollinger cellar, the workmen did not know that history. They knew only what lay at their feet, skull after skull with the neat voids of missing front teeth, jawbones robbed of molars. A laborer retched. Another spat and crossed himself. In a back-pocket ledger, likely the foreman's, someone wrote, bad business in the wall, Hull, Gures built it. Tell Mr. B. Back in 1825, the signs were quieter. A traveling knife. Grinder spent a Sunday dinner telling the tavern table what he'd seen at the Hollingers. Not violence, not the stuff of lurid broadsides, but a kind of tidiness that didn't sit right. He'd been called to sharpen tools. Shears, scalpels, hand saws. Never seen a family so particular, he said, about what sits where and who looks in which room. He laughed, then didn't. Their cellar smells like peppermint and the sour of a cookpot. The tavern keeper told him to mind his tongue. The Hollingers had just paid for new benches in the meeting house, a midwife, who sometimes assisted when families could not bring themselves to wash the dead, remembered, years later, a white cloth over the faces, at the Hollinger house that she never saw elsewhere. I thought it was sorrow, she told her granddaughter. I think now it was something else. When she lifted one cloth, the mouth beneath had a blackness at the gum line. He must have smoked a pipe, she said then, and did not look again. The ledger from that time, attributed to Matthias Serre, lists small objects as if they were fees. On watch no chain. a ring of brass, 2 teeth. In the margin by that last, a notation in smaller, sharper hand, Debtor P recompensed. And yet, when a constable, young, earnest, went up the Hollinger's steps to ask why so many strangers died under their roof, he came back down with less than when he went in. They serve the Lord, his superior said. Let the Lord count. The constable folded his suspicion and put it away. Time is the best accomplice and the worst witness. In the 1850s, the Hollinger property changed hands, sold to a man who stacked barrels in the front room and used the old washing table for glue. The cellar, cool and steady in all seasons, was a perfect place to store things the living wanted out of their way. If any family story circulated about what the Hollingers built behind, it didn't make it into the deed. It took until the 1880s, late in the century, when towns were modernizing and plumbing ran like new veins, for the wall to come down. A renovation crew, hired to shore up the foundation and install a boiler, pried at a seam where the stonework didn't match the rest. It sounded wrong, hollow. A pry bar made a fist-sized hole. A lantern peered through, then a man. The first skull was inches from the gap, eyeless, jaw agape. He jerked back so hard he knocked into his mate. The wall fell in a coughing rush of lime and dust. A stack of bones, arranged almost respectfully, as if someone could not help themselves from bringing order to what they had done. 31 skulls by the foreman's count, though the coroner's clerk wrote over 30 in his notes. The stack reached almost to the joists. There were scraps of shroud, a buckle, a brass button crushed into a femur. No coffin boards, no markers, no scripture pinned above them, only stone and silence. The sheriff sealed the house. The coroner, Lancaster County's Dr. S., took samples, measured long bones, made sketches. His work mattered, and then it did not. 2 days after he finished, the pastor of the Hollingers church visited the county offices. No visitor log survives, but a receptionist's descendant swore, late in life, that her grandmother saw the pastor leave a folded paper and a Bible on the coroner's desk. He said a prayer, she said, and then nobody said anything for a long while. When a researcher in the 1890s went looking for Dr. S.'s report, he found only the stub of a receipt in the register's log. The file jacket was there, the paper brittle and blank. Across the front, in a calm hand that must have written that phrase many times about many innocuous things, the blue pencil. Records removed for preservation. Who were the Hollingers? What happened in that cellar? Why did a wall become a crypt? Historians, local sleuths, and families with long memories offer theories that hold like shadows, clear until you reach out. Theory 13: Murder for profit. This is the story that unfurls from the bones and the ledger in a straight, cold line. The victims fit a profile: traveling salesmen and widows without kin, people no one could afford to miss loudly. The Hollingers controlled the point of entry and exit. They received the sick and claimed the dead. They had access to bodies, privacy, and an economy that rewards disposal and discourages questions. The missing teeth point to commerce with dentists, common in the era, with Waterloo teeth, an accepted trade. The ledger's entries: remittance recorded from the deceased, read as euphemism for theft, cloaked as accounting. The victim's valuables become the family's income. The wall becomes logistics. The family in this telling are not undertakers but a trap. Theory 2: the resurrectionist case. In 1820s Pennsylvania, medical schools in Philadelphia needed cadavers for anatomy lessons. Laws discouraged dissection of citizens. A market grew for resurrection men, who supplied bodies quietly. Undertakers were well positioned to profit, and some did. This theory posits that the Hollingers harvested teeth and laundered bodies through their cellar, waiting for night to send them downriver to the city. The false wall may have been a storage solution when the traffic got risky or demand dropped, but the bones found decades later argue against ongoing transport. The bodies never left. If the Hollingers were suppliers, they were also archivers, stacking what they could not move and hoping the wall would hold. It did, until it didn't. Theory 3: death by care. There is a darker tenderness in this version. The Hollingers attended the sick and the poor, administering tonics and cordials, laudanum for pain, camphor and wintergreen for purification, perhaps a touch of arsenic from preservative recipes, drifting west from Europe. They intended to preserve the dignity of death, but their tools hastened it. The sicknesses they claimed were real, the deaths avoidable. The ledgers, remittances, are the pennies of the poor, pocketed with a prayer. Teeth were extracted as a matter of habit. One more ooze, wrung from the dead in a time when thrift sanctified everything. They did wrong, but in the name of rightness, as they understood it. This is the most merciful version, and the damning one, murder disguised as medicine even to itself. Theory 4, a cover-up for others. The Hollingers' church ties mattered. In towns like Mill Creek, pastors knit communities together and smoothed scandal away. What if the bones in the wall were not all the Hollingers? What if other townsmen, drunk on power or greed, brought their blunt sins to the cellar to be hidden under the Hollingers' piety? The missing coroner's report then becomes self-protection. The pastor who delivered a prayer to a county office was delivering a warning. Records removed for preservation. Reads like the county telling itself that some things must be preserved by never being read again. In this reading, the Hollingers are criminals, yes, but not alone. Theory 50, folklore overreach. Skeptics point out the anachronism. Embalming as a routine practice would come decades later, and rural undertakers were more carpenter than surgeon. Perhaps the embalming cellar was a simple washroom. Perhaps the bones came from an older, forgotten burial ground disturbed by renovations. Teeth are often lost in the soil, valuables vanish to soil or scavengers. The ledger, it could be a family account book misread by modern eyes hungry for horror. This theory leans on how hunger distorts sight, but stacked skeletons behind a false wall resist the skeptic's comfort. Forgotten graveyards don't arrange themselves. Who investigated? Officially the sheriff, the coroner, and, briefly, the county prosecutors who decided what would meet a jury and what would not. Unofficially everyone. The midwife remembered the white cloth. The knife, Grinder wrote, peppermint and sour. On a scrap, a traveling preacher testified that he saw more bodies in that cellar than the winter could explain. There is a letter from 1832 in which a neighboring undertaker complains to a cousin. Hollingers take more than their share, and some from the Lord's own fields. It sounds like envy until you read it under the light of the wall. The records called it misfortune. The locals whispered something else entirely. After the wall came down, the town stood in two minds. There were those who said, bury them proper. There were those who said nothing at all. A committee formed, men with clean collars and daughters in white gloves, and arranged a collective interment in a corner of the old meeting house ground. A small stone went up 10, unknown, known to God, no names. How could there be? The ledger, if it held any, did not give them. Most entries read stranger, widow, traveler, the kinds of words that turn a person into a category, and then into an excuse. The Hollinger name, once spoken with a kind of rural awe, became a whisper you crossed a street to avoid. The sons moved, one to Ohio, one to Baltimore, where no one had reason to look too closely at his last name. The daughter married out of the county and, if she ever thought of the cellar, didn't write it down. Matthias Cesar died, when, precisely, the records omit. It's as if the town, having discovered what the house held, lost interest in the man who built it. In 1892, when the archive clerk wrote, records removed for preservation, he preserved something else entirely: plausible deniability. There is an alarmingly modern logic in that pencil line. He tells himself it is for the stability of the paper, for the safety of the files. But history is not a stack of pages in a safe room. It is the air we breathe without thinking. Remove the report, and you preserve the reputations of the living at the expense of the dead. Today, the old property lies under a neat grid of modern homes. White vinyl fences, maple saplings, bicycles tipped on their sides as if resting. Locals still call that block Hollow Yard, a pun that holds more truth than the developers might like. On humid nights, people say, a sweet, acrid scent rises from the ground, wintergreen and something metallic, fancy maybe, or memory, or the earth still whispering chemistry through soil the way old houses whisper secrets through plaster. The larger legacy is not a smell, it is a lesson. In 1825, Americans were inventing professional death, turning the oldest human ritual into a service someone could sell. When you introduce money into the sacred, you invite wolves to put on albs and call themselves shepherds. The Hollingers, in any reading, exploited a weakness, the fear of dying alone. They monetized anonymity. They encountered bodies loved by no living person powerful enough to make a fuss. And they decided those bodies were disposable. We like to think we've outgrown that. We have not. We call it by other names. And then there's the weight of the erased. How many stories survive only because a wall failed? How many sins remain tucked behind the brickwork of respectability because no renovation needs to run a pipe through them? The museum labels the past. The ground contains it. When a community chooses to file a coroner's report under the emptiest word, preservation, what they preserve is their ability to keep attending the same church, nodding at the same pews, holding their potlucks without ever having to speak aloud what their town once was. Perhaps the truth still lies hidden, in a pastor's diary whose heirs won't release it, in a box marked Hollinger, Miss, in a descendant's attic, in the silt at the bottom of Mill Creek, where wedding rings skated on their way to a slow resting place. Or perhaps this is all the truth anyone will get, a ledger that reads like a confession written in accountancy, bones that say, "We were here," and a pencil note that admits, without courage, that someone thought it best if you didn't know. We leave Mill Creek with a wall broken, a file emptied, and a name that curdles the mouth. The Hollingers called their work Christian. The ledger called it remittance. The ground called it murder, or something so near that the distinction is a cruelty. So we turn to you. Which theory makes the most sense? Were the Hollingers calculating killers, harvesting teeth and coins from people no one would miss? Were they resurrectionists gone stagnant, their inventory entombed when the risk grew too great? Did their medicines become methods, cordials laced with preservatives, that preserved nothing but suspicion? Or is this story a case of the town burying more than bones? Its complicity, its leaders' protection, its unwillingness to pull a thread that would unravel Sunday mornings? Tell us in the comments, what detail disturbed you most? The white cloth laid over faces, the line, "Remittance recorded from the deceased," the skulls with their neat gaps, or that blue, pencil epitaph, "Records removed for preservation." And if you're from Pennsylvania, or you know Mill Creek, what whispers have you heard about Hollow Yard? If this episode gripped you, tap like and subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into America's darkest historical mysteries. Share this with someone who thinks the past behaves itself. It doesn't. And tell us where you're listening from. Our community stretches from Lancaster County to the farthest coasts, and your stories help guide where we go next. In our next episode, we'll open another sealed room, a prairie asylum, with a ledger of entries written in numbers instead of names, where the column marked "Released" aligns too often with the river's flood stage, and where one rusted key found in a clay bank may be the only witness left. You won't want to miss it.